So one of the first things to notice about the Gospels is that they're texts, they're documents. That's what they are, which means somebody wrote them, and somebody wrote them because they had something to say, and people kept copies and shared copies around because they enjoyed what was in these documents. And when we actually look at the sort of explosion of documents, of Gospels even, between the time of Jesus and say around about 300, when things really start to get a bit more regulated, we find that they were circulating infancy Gospels. In other words, stories that elaborated the biblical narratives, which are very simple in terms of the birth of Jesus. Well, they give us the backstory. People love that sort of stuff. You've got Gospels that have the sayings of Jesus, and you have Gospels that are focused on the role of various apostles, like Mary, say Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Mary, and the Gospel of Peter, and the Gospel of Thomas, and so on. In the case of the New Testament Gospels, what we're dealing with, particularly with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you've got three Gospels that are very closely connected, and they tell very much the same story. Jesus starts out in Galilee, causes a bit of interest, raises a bit of interest, causes a bit of controversy, makes his way to Jerusalem for the first and only time in his life, really. Now, Luke has him there as a 12-year-old, but it's in the prologue to Luke's Gospel. And then, of course, the events of the last week or so of Jesus' life, Easter and resurrection, which they all deal with totally differently. Mark kind of almost doesn't have it, because probably the script is damaged. Matthew has resurrection happening has the appearance happening up in the Galilee, on a mountain in the Galilee. And Luke relocates Easter to Jerusalem. There's no going to Galilee for anything. Luke is never going to have the gospel go back to Galilee. It has to go to Rome. So they kind of diverge a bit at the end in terms of how they tell the Easter story. But the story is very, very, very familiar story. And so we often read the three Gospels together, and in church we read, year A is Matthew, year B is Mark, year C is Luke. Same basic story flowing through. John's Gospel, very, very different. Jesus is popping down to Jerusalem several times. There's not a story that starts here and makes its way towards the end. It's a much more repetitive, circular kind of story. And much more a story about the divine Son of God teaching the wisdom that we need in order to understand who he is, which is a very different kind of way of... So John is heading more towards the sort of the kind of Gnostic Gospels, which were focused on the teaching of Jesus, whereas Matthew, Mark and Luke are much more focused on the activity of Jesus, which included teaching, but also included healing and exorcism and lots of meals and travelling around and so on.